Welcome to the Gorman Trubitt Dealership Controllers Roundtable webinar series. Due to the COVID-19 concerns and to keep our guests and employees safe, we have migrated our annual Summer Controllers Roundtable to a virtual format. We want to continue to provide you with the dealership-focused CPE you have come to expect from Gorman Trubitt. The series will continue on through the summer and into the fall and will be available on YouTube for your convenience. This webinar is presented by Fisher & Phillips, LLP. It focuses on how dealers and other employers must navigate ADA, OSHA, FMLA, and a host of employment laws as we all adjust to the new normal of workplace after the pandemic. It was recorded live as a Zoom webinar on June 18, 2020, and all information was accurate and up to date at that time. If you have any questions regarding this webinar or future CRT webinars, please feel free to email us at askus@lgt-cpa.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible.
So I'd like to welcome everybody to our virtual Controllers Roundtable. All right, well, we've been putting on the Controllers Roundtable for around 25 years, where we present dealership-specific CPE to controllers, CFOs, and owners. I'm Colin Kanalakis. I'm a partner with Gorman Trubitt. I handle audits, reviews, tax, consulting, and lots of other things for our dealership clients. I'm joined by Patrick Riley, another Urban Dealership partners. He specializes mainly in audits, reviews, and consulting for dealers. He and I have been pretty ingrained with some of our other partners and team members in the PPP program and putting on presentations, and now starting to assist with the forgiveness calculations and questions go along with it. It's really a fun and exciting time. We're joined today by Steve Rapolo. He's managing partner with Fisher & Phillips. He's over the Dallas and the Houston offices in their regions, and we're very happy to have Steve back. He's one of our regulars in presenting when we have our physical meetings. While we're hopeful that we'll still have a meeting in October, we actually would like to get some feedback from you guys today. And we'll continue to determine if logistics will work, and of course, where things are when it comes to October. Anyway, this year marks LGT's 70th year. We're a full-service CPA firm based in Dallas-Fort Worth, serving Texas Southwest with clients all over the U.S. We do have upcoming events. As I mentioned, we have our October Controllers Roundtable, but our next CRT virtual meeting will be July the 21st at 10 a.m. Central Time. That's July 21st. KPA will be presenting. I'd like to thank Steve again for joining us, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to him to get started.
Thanks, Colin. I appreciate being invited back. It's been a pleasure to participate in the Controllers Roundtable that LGT has put on for all these years. It's different a little bit in that we're dealing with technology, and while it may seem that I am familiar with technology, I am wholly reliant upon the folks at LGT, and I thank them for helping to put this on. I'm basically just talking into my computer, which is a little bit of an odd thing. I know you're all out there, and it's not quite the same as seeing your faces, and I do miss that. But I do know you're there, and I'm happy to be able to present this webinar in this virtual Controllers Roundtable. One of the things that we're going to try to do is, as Colin mentioned, is make this feel as much as our regular programs with the interactive raising of hands and asking questions as I go along. We're going to do our best to get to them. If for whatever reason that's not working because of either technology issues or because I just kind of plow ahead to the next slide, don't worry about that. What we can do then is make sure you include it in the chat box, and then we can try to circle back around at the end and answer questions that way. So the program today, as you all can see from the slide that's up there right now, is about how dealerships can prepare as they're bringing employees back to work now that is really part of what's happening in Texas with respect to opening of businesses. You'll note that we initially titled this program After a Pandemic, but I added an asterisk as literally this week, in part because it occurred to me that, number one, we may in fact see a second wave in the fall, and so that's technically part of the same pandemic. But even more recently, with the uptick in cases and hospitalizations in Texas, in a sense, Texas is really currently dealing with its first spike. New York, some other places had some very significant cases early on in late March and April. If you were following the news, Texas just was sailing through with flying colors. We weren't having a significant number of cases, and I think that led to a bit of overconfidence on the part of our health officials and our government, and even our business leaders. And I'm one of them. I thought this was a piece of cake, and I'm now seeing that these upticking cases may, in fact, require that we revisit some things as we go forward. But the program today is going to be, dealing with the kinds of steps you can take to make sure that even if there is this uptick, you're going to be in a position to be flexible and deal with these issues in connection with your employees and your customers as things go along. So we will begin by moving to the first slide here. Let's see if I can make this happen. All right, there we go. I told you technology was not my strong suit. What can I tell you? All right, so restarting the plan of action. These are the kind of very preliminary steps that you all may have already been engaged in. Hopefully you have. The first thing is you don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. You're going to want to have a core group of managers, probably your department managers, who are going to be the core COVID-19 response team. These are going to be people who are not only going to put together the written work return plan, but in addition, they're going to be the ones, as things need to be adjusted as time goes by, they're the ones who are going to be knowledgeable about the operations of the dealership, how they've been adjusted to deal with COVID, both for customers and employees. And also, they're going to be familiar with COVID because they're going to have been working through this process from the very beginning. It's important for them to have knowledge of the operational aspect of the dealership, because what's a core piece of this is reimagining how you're going to actually carry out these services to your customers. Obviously, some things can't be changed. A service technician needs to work on the transmission. He can't do that from home. He can't do it virtually. He needs to be there, have his hands on the transmission to get it fixed. The same is true for some other functions of the dealership. But as we've seen throughout this period of time, there are some things that can be adjusted, particularly with respect to sales. Some dealerships have gone to home delivery. Some dealerships have ramped up their ability to provide estimates of trade-in values to customers by, online operations, submissions of photographs and detailed information. And all of that has been kind of thrust upon dealerships in a way that has forced them to change, or at least consider changing their processes. The same is true for employees as well. Many employees during this period of time can perform functions from home and have been in a position to do that and be just as productive as they were before. I can tell you from our own experience running a law firm, an office of a law firm, we were apprehensive at first about having both staff and attorneys working from home, attempting to do, silence that. Sorry about that, folks. People call me. I don't know what's going on. But we were really apprehensive. We weren't sure how efficient people were going to be. Could they actually carry out their work in an effective way from home? And it's turned out, looking purely at the numbers, but also talking to people, that they were able to do so very efficiently. Clients were getting service the same way. Cell phones were obviously in use a lot more than usual, but that is something that was already trending in that direction anyway. So we've reimagined our processes as dealerships had as well. And I think that is something that can linger through this kind of mid-level pandemic time until we get to a vaccine. And honestly, when we talk about after the pandemic, that really means after a vaccine, because until then, there's just too much risk of spikes, too much risk of second waves, and so forth. And so when we talk about after the pandemic, I think the vaccine is really the key that we're all looking for. When that day comes, the interesting thing I think will be how accessible will the vaccine be? Will it be available to everyone on a regular basis? Will we see just in big cities? Will we see it in smaller towns? That's going to be an interesting thing that the government's going to have to sort through as they deal with the vaccine issues. But part of this restarting plan is going to be developing some procedures and policies about how to deal with an environment at work where there's a higher risk of transmitting a relatively serious disease. So we're going to talk about that. The slides you'll see as we go forward are going to be kind of outlining the steps that you all will need to include in this written return to work plan. So as we proceed, those are the suggestions that we're going to see, but ultimately we think it's best that it's in writing so that you can be in a position to make sure everybody understands clearly what you're doing. So there are some practical concerns as well, in addition to legal concerns, that you're going to want to focus on. It is not nearly as difficult getting PPE and other supplies as it was earlier in the process. If any of you tried to get masks or other PPE early in this process, you probably found it very difficult. You were scrounging everywhere to find it. It's not nearly as difficult now as it was at the beginning. Certainly hospitals and healthcare facilities had a real tough time with this early on. That seems to have gotten better as well. But it is important to get a supply that you will not run out of. The same is true for disinfecting and cleaning supplies. When we talk about cleaning and disinfection, we're talking about a different concept than we would see just a regular janitorial services. You may have already worked on this with your janitorial vendors, or if you have your own staff, you may have directed them to do things a little bit differently. But the best practices in this environment is to do not only day-to-day cleaning, but in addition, if possible, cleaning throughout the day of surfaces that are touched regularly by other individuals. For most employers, that's countertops, that's copy machines, anything with buttons, those kinds of things that you have regularly, clean them regularly if people are using them all the time. One of the things that we have done internally is we've provided our staff with something called cootie keys. I'm not sure if you've ever heard that term. I didn't until I looked it up. Somebody suggested it, and we have gotten them available for people. And what they are essentially is a little plastic device that attaches to your keychain or to your fob that you use to get in for security. And it has a little rubber tip that allows you to press buttons without actually touching things. So it's great for elevators. It's great for buttons on a copy machine or an ATM machine. And so we've distributed those, and I wish I had stock in the Cootie Key Company, because I think they're probably doing pretty well right now. But the day-to-day, within the day, cleaning efforts are really important as we deal with this potential passage of coronavirus. The other thing that you would want to see with respect to cleaning is a regular deep clean. That means that not just wiping down surfaces, but really using substantially stronger chemicals to make sure that we're making sure there's no risk of the coronavirus being, lingering on a surface. The latest information we're receiving from healthcare officials is that it is less likely for coronavirus to remain active and viable on surfaces like cardboard and other hard surfaces, and that by far the largest risk is in extended contact with another individual, particularly spending 10 or 15 minutes or more in a smaller space with another person. So that's going to have an impact in dealing with customers. It's going to have an impact in employees working in close quarters. And so we'll talk about that as we get into some of those steps about how to make sure we avoid that transmission. And that really isn't directly related to cleaning. I think cleaning is a big part of it, but in fact, as we get to the issues of masks, spatial, social distancing, and other space issues, you're going to see that that really is going to be, I think, the primary focus for employers. You know, we will also talk a little bit about health screening and health, what we call health attestations. These are essentially people telling us that they are healthy, that they do not have currently a temperature, that they do not have a cough or shortness of breath. And those are things that are being contemplated by employers and by businesses that have customers come onto the premises. You know, some employers are even encouraging other forms of commuting and transportation if they're actually having their people come to the office. We know from the experience that the Chinese have had and other places where there is heavy reliance on public transportation, that there is a significant risk associated with being on a bus, a subway, and the like. So many employers have encouraged employees to consider other forms of transportation, whether carpool, whether using their own vehicle, and have actually considered subsidizing that to some degree with respect to parking and other costs associated with that kind of transportation. I can tell you just as an example, you know, public transportation, for those of us in Texas, that's not really a big issue because all of us drive. It's kind of a big deal. But in some of our offices in big cities, like in New York and San Francisco, where the reliance on public transportation is significant, the idea of driving is not really something that comes up to them. It is too expensive for parking. It's too complicated to get the vehicles, you know, from their home to their office in terms of traffic. And so it's a big deal for folks like them. For us, it's not as big a deal. Honestly, the one thing that I've enjoyed about this pandemic, other than sitting on my porch and watching people walk up and down the street in a way I never really did before, is the lack of traffic. So particularly for those of us in Dallas and in Houston and Austin, you know, enjoy it while you can. It's not going to be like this forever, but the traffic has been tolerable. It's getting worse, but it's been tolerable. And again, training of managers and employees and signage is something that's important as well. It may seem like not an important thing to have a sign that reminds people to wear a mask or have a sign that reminds people for how many individuals ought to be in a bathroom. But I can tell you from my own personal experience, having that reminder is helpful. I still don't always remember to have my mask handy so I can take it with me when I walk down the hall to go to the bathroom. But I do have the mask, and I have it. I'm not going to wear it on this call because there's no need to do that. There's a little chance that I'm going to breathe on anybody through the internet. But having it handy and having the ability to go down the hall is a really important thing. But having the reminder in case I forget is really important. So signage is going to be critical as well. All right, so your human resources department is going to have a big role in this process. They're going to be ones, I think, that need to be part of this COVID response team. So they're critical to this process, both in terms of helping to develop the protocols, but also, most importantly, helping to develop the communications to employees so they understand what's going on. You know, you're going to have a range of reactions from your employees on these issues. Some people will view the rules that you create and attempt to enforce to be onerous and big brother-like. Others will view them as being not strong enough to ensure their protection against coronavirus. So the response will be across the board. And the key with these communications is to try to strike the right balance between making sure people understand we're interested in protection, but we're also trying to do things in a way that will allow them to work effectively. So that is where I think a human resources person can be very helpful in developing those communications. We talked a little bit about cleaning and disinfection so that we can have a healthy workforce, and we talked a little bit about signage as well. And then the protocols for customers and on-site visitors, it's really an interesting thing as it relates to automobile dealerships, because you've got showrooms. You're a very open environment. You've got people coming to look at vehicles, to negotiate, to buy a vehicle. And I can tell you that in my own experience, having dealt with some dealerships during this process, showing up at a dealership and sitting in a showroom on a Saturday at the height of this pandemic was pretty remarkable. There were tons of people around, and there were steps that were being taken, in my experience at dealerships, to try to make sure that customers were not feeling unwelcome, but they also were feeling protected. And so we want to continue to do that as time goes on, because it's a critical piece of making sure that we're protecting health, but also doing what we can to make customers feel comfortable. And of course, your management and supervisors need to be trained. You don't want to just throw them out there, because they're going to be asked questions about what they need to do in order to, what employees need to do in order to be compliant with these new rules. And if your supervisors and managers don't understand the rules, don't know the rules, then they're going to be in a position where they can't be very helpful communicating to your employees. So you're going to want to make sure that they're able to impart this information in a way that is supportive of the dealership's overall approach to dealing with employees. The last thing you want to have is a manager that rolls his eyes and discounts the rules that you have in place. That is not supportive of the dealership's mission. So you're going to want to make sure they understand, even if they don't agree with every single rule that's being rolled out, that they understand that they must toe the party line. They have to be clear to the employees that this is what the dealership is going to require, and it's important, and it's something that we expect all of the employees to do. And again, we've talked about the idea of being flexible and updating policies. Your managers and supervisors are going to be the ones on the front line who are going to be able to communicate that most effectively. And so it's critical that they understand what their obligations are as time goes on. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about some things that you can do to improve workplace safety. As many of you all know, your dealerships are covered by by OSHA, and so OSHA has the general safety, the general duty standard to ensure a safe workplace. They have provided guidance, OSHA, as well as EEOC and CDC. And so certainly all of the alphabet soup of our government agencies have been providing guidance on these things. The one that you probably are most familiar with is social distancing. I don't know how they came up with 6 feet. I don't know why 5 feet wasn't the number, or 10 feet. I mean, I'm a kind of an even number guy. But you know what? I remember 6 feet. Just like now, I remember 100.4 is the temperature where we say you can't come back. It's weird how these numbers stick in your head. But, having social distancing in the workplace is much more complicated. Certainly, we would want to do what we can to provide kind of visual cues to both customers and employees about what can and cannot be done in terms of spatial distancing. If you've been to any retail operations, you've probably seen stickers on the floors, tape on the floors, guidance in that respect as visual cues. And you probably have some of these in your dealership already. What I would encourage you to consider, though, is do so in your employee non-public workspaces as well. This is going to be helpful to people just as, again, like signage, a physical reminder of what they're supposed to be doing. We have not yet done this in the office, and it's something, as we have done our kind of soft reopen this week, I have realized that we need to do. We have secretaries in our law offices that are in kind of bullpen areas throughout this office space, and our lawyers are in offices with doors that close. For the lawyers with doors that close, it's really simple. They can take off their masks, they can do work just like I'm doing now, and there's no real complications. But for the secretaries and for when attorneys interact with secretaries, it's more complicated. So we say to everyone, if you're going to have that interaction over a counter or something like that, that's less than 6 feet. And in that instance, we want to do what we can to make it at least 6 feet and have a mask so that if they're within 6 feet, it is something that is going to be more protection. Keep in mind, public areas, like I'm in my office right now, the door is closed. I don't consider this a public area, but the hallways I consider a public area. The bathrooms I consider a public area. The elevator lobby is public. The elevators themselves are public. And, you know, you should consider yourselves fortunate to be working in dealerships because, you know, maybe you've got a 2-story operation, maybe 3 in some instances. That's pretty rare. I'm on the 40th floor of a high-rise building in downtown Houston, and elevators are my newest thing I dislike because what happens is there's a limit to 2 per elevator. I was telling Colin and Patrick before our program that our office in San Francisco has a rule that only 1 person per elevator can be in at any given time, and there aren't too many. So there are times when they'll have to wait 45 minutes to get up to the office. And so guess what they're doing? They're going home, and they're working from their home office again. So you don't really have that problem as much with elevators. I would encourage you, for those of you who do have elevators that permit someone to get from one floor to the next, that you limit it to 2 or 1. You know, it won't take long for them to wait. Also, there's the stairs. They can always take the stairs, and in those instances, I do think having masks are a good idea, because as you turn the corner on the stairs, you don't know whether you're going to run right into someone. And if you are up close to someone, it's much better to be covered with a mask than to not. So let's move now on to some other issues relating to workplace safety. And one of them is taking temperatures. Some jurisdictions are actually requiring that you all do this before you actually allow someone on the premises. That's not really the case in Texas. It's more optional. And there is an alternative, of course, to providing a questionnaire with respect to health, a health attestation where people are kind of basically making a statement about their current health. But if you're going to do taking temperatures, there are a number of ways to do it. Some of you all may have seen that for about $100, you can buy on Amazon a temperature gun. You know, this is something that you can literally kind of point at someone's forehead and you can kind of gauge their temperature without any actual touching. Now, you're close enough, though, that you want to make sure the temperature taker, even with a temperature gun, is protected with PPE. They don't have to be fully PPE'd up like an emergency room doctor, but it is better to have gloves, to have a face shield if possible, at a minimum a mask, and to be you know, in a position where because they're going to be dealing with people that they don't know in many cases. The question many dealerships have is, do we do this with customers as well? The most conservative position is to say, yes, we'd like to see customers before they come in the showroom to actually be able to, you know, identify themselves and then subject to themselves to a temperature taking, you know, situation that can take maybe 30 seconds to a minute. Other dealerships that say, we're not doing that. We don't want to do anything to run the risk of the customer feeling like we're Big Brother and they might just run out the front door. But it is something to think about because, you know, I don't know if any of you all have been through this process. I actually had to, when I was attending a mediation a couple of weeks ago at another law office in Houston. They took us one at a time into a little room. They, you know, pointed the little gun at my head. They found out I didn't have a temperature. They made me sign something, and then I was done. It didn't take more than 45 seconds. I didn't find it objectionable in any way. I mean, I actually kind of was reassured by the fact they were doing it to other people. So the opposing counsel, I was pretty sure wasn't, you know, active in terms of any kind of infection. And then he also signed the document as well. So that was reassuring. You may find it's reassuring to other customers, that other customers will know when they're having their temperature taken, that they will feel that maybe it's a bother to get my own temperature taken, but if they're doing it to me, they're doing it to others. And that might be something that is more comfortable for them. Now, what I will say about this, again, the more recent information is that it is not chance encounters that typically are problematic and where we have the higher risk of COVID transmission. It's where you are spending more time with a customer, not less time. So if it's An encounter at a parts counter where somebody's just picking up a part and leaving and it's only a couple of minutes, probably not as necessary for temperature taking. On the other hand, if it is a customer who's coming in to negotiate a purchase of a vehicle, to negotiate a trade, that's when you're going to be spending more time with that person. And to protect your employee, it might be worthwhile to go through some of these processes with respect to taking temperatures. One of the things to keep in mind, if you're going to be taking the temperature on a regular basis of your customer, of your employees, when you do so, there are some wage hour issues you need to consider for non-exempt employees. So for your hourly people, it is the best practice to have them clock in first, then have their temperature taken in case there's any amount of time that is above what we would call de minimis, that they are sitting around waiting to have their temperature taken at the request of the employer. So if you can have them punch in first, go have their temperature taken, you can avoid any risk of any kind of collective action from somebody who says, boy, if he added up all the time I spent waiting to have my temperature taken, it would be hours and hours of time that I wasn't compensated for. We worry about that because we're always worried about wage hour collective actions. And so it's something to keep in mind as you're evaluating whether to, what is the logistics for somebody getting their temperature taken at the beginning of the shift. All right. We are hearing about antibody testing and other, health-related information, as well as regular COVID testing. Now, many of you all know how COVID testing works. This is testing for an active infection of coronavirus. This is where you actually have what amounts to a giant Q-tip shoved up your nose, and basically it scrapes the inside of your frontal lobe. It is not a pleasant experience. I don't know whether any of you all have dealt with it. I have. I had a test taken before I came back to start leading the office, and it's not fun, but it's certainly better to know than not to know. But that is an active infection coronavirus test. The EEOC says that's okay to give a test, to require that test of an employee before they come back to work, or even on a regular random basis. They're saying that that is job-related and consistent with business necessity, which is what has to happen before a medical inquiry can be given to an employee. Otherwise, it would violate the ADA, because the Americans with Disabilities Act requires that medical inquiries of current employees be done minimally, if ever. If in that if ever time, it's got to be, again, job related. And so in this coronavirus environment, they have indicated that COVID testing, the swab test, needs to be done on a regular basis in a way that is consistent with that job-related approach that I've been describing. And it's okay. It is something that the EEOC has approved. Antibody testing, on the other hand, is not. They originally indicated that antibody testing, if you wanted to have somebody tested for antibodies, and by the way, this is a blood test, it's not a swab test, that the antibody testing was just like the active COVID testing, permitted as being job-related. This week, the EEOC has indicated, based upon CDC guidance that they have received, that it is not job-related. And I'm not exactly sure where CDC is coming out on this, where they're coming from, saying it's different. I know that there are questions about the reliability of some antibody tests, and there are dozens and dozens of these tests out there. So it may be part of that. All I know is that they're indicating to us that there has to be some additional information beyond just, hey, you work for me, go take an antibody test. If that's all there is, they're going to consider that an impermissible medical inquiry that would violate the ADA. So again, short version, swab test okay, COVID antibody test not okay, unless something else is being presented to the employer. Now, I talked a little bit before about OSHA. Again, all of these issues that we've been discussing are covered by OSHA. So you're going to want to make sure that you are having everything cleared by a lawyer who's familiar with OSHA to make sure that you are in compliance with that general duty standard. The reality is that if you are taking the steps that we've described, you're not going to have any problem with OSHA. OSHA is essentially just interested in making sure that you're doing something. And the things that we're talking about are things that are going to be sufficient in order to make sure you comply with that general duty standard. So let's talk for a moment about masks or face coverings. And to be clear, when I use the term mask in this program, I'm referring really to cloth face coverings. If I were talking to healthcare facilities or employees who work there, I'd be talking about masks in a different way, because I'd be talking about the N95, the medical masks that are much more protective of the person who is actually wearing the mask. It is a protective device for that person wearing it. Face coverings, on the other hand, are really designed to protect those around the individual wearing the face covering. And so it is really not considered a really helpful and effective protection for the wearer. Having said that, it's important that we take care of all of our employees. And so we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to have one of our employees not transmit something to another. Now, there are various legal requirements for face coverings out there. If you have read the news in the past couple of days, you've probably seen that there is kind of, in the past 24 hours, a change in what's happening in Texas with respect to face covering rules. In Houston, our county executive issued an order back in April that required all individuals who weren't in their homes to wear face coverings or to be subject to a monetary fine. That was not well received by the populace, by the governor, and the governor in his executive order essentially said that local county and city executives cannot make such rules up. Or if they did, they needed to be consistent with the governor's orders that have been being issued. Now, what has happened in the past several days, as you probably know, is that there's been a spike in hospitalizations and new cases of coronavirus in Texas. And it's caused some of the local executives, the government executives, to revisit the idea of having face coverings. And the idea is actually fairly sound in my view, because it is an attempt, I think, to balance the idea of continuing to open our economy with the idea of protecting our citizenry. And so trying to balance those is the idea that if we're going to have people out and about spending money, doing things out in public, we also want to make sure that they're doing so in a way that minimizes the risk of this transmission. So the face covering issue has been a hot button topic for county executives. They actually reached out to the governor to say, hey, would you consider if we actually issued ordinances or executive orders of our own requiring people to wear masks? The governor said, no, I don't want to allow that. And then the county executive in San Antonio, Nelson Wolf, actually issued an order a day or two ago that said, I am not requiring individuals to wear face coverings, but I am requiring businesses to require that their employees and customers wear face coverings. They asked the governor, whether the reporters did, whether he was okay with that. And to many people's surprise, the governor said, yeah, that's okay with me. That's consistent with my order. He did so in kind of an interesting way, kind of suggesting, hey, it was that way all along. I don't know why people didn't read my order. They could always do this, and they didn't. But no, to answer the question, local governments can issue those orders. So in Bexar County, that's the law effective Monday. I fully believe that the county executives in Travis County, in Harris County, in Dallas County, in Fort Worth, in Tarrant County, you're going to see these kinds of rules being issued by the county executives, which are going to be interesting because they will impact dealerships in an interesting way, because if they require that you wear these, in some ways it's actually going to be helpful, because you can say, hey, the county executive requires it, so sorry, we've got to have you wear this mask. So in that instance, you're going to want to have a supply that's even greater than you had before of masks masks available, not only for your employees, but for your customers. Now, what we expect to see on some of these ordinances or executive orders from local government leaders to limit the circumstances in which they're going to need to wear masks. I, for one, am not a big fan of wearing masks while I eat. It's not an effective way of eating, I find. You know, I know that there are, I like having my waiter wear a mask. I like having the cooks wear masks, but I'm not a big fan of wearing masks while I try to eat food. So, you know, that would, I'm sure, be an exception to the face mask wearing rules. Similarly, as I understand the Bexar County rule, if you are in a closed environment with no one else present and there's no chance of anyone being near you, you can take off the mask, even though you're an employee in the county where the rule is in place. So I would expect that we would see something very similar to what we, for example, in this office currently have. That is, we currently have a rule that says if you're in a public area, a hallway, a bathroom, a lobby, you need to wear a mask. If you don't, then you don't need to wear a mask. And I suspect that's going to be very consistent with what we're going to see. The difference is going to be, again, the government's requiring it as opposed to us just doing it as a best practice. So if you're doing it as a best practice, I don't think you're going to find much of a disruption. And in fact, as I mentioned, it may very well be the excuse that you can implement this rule dealing with customers as well. So as I see it, you may wind up seeing a circumstance in which you are going to require people in your showroom to wear masks if you're in a county where one of these rules is in place. If you're not, it's going to be optional. It will be completely voluntary on your part as to whether you want to require it or not. So if you are mandating it, or if the government is mandating it, who pays for those masks? In my experience, many people have their own masks now. In the beginning of this, people didn't. But now, as I walk through the tunnels in Houston, I see 90% of the people wearing masks. They have their own. They want to have one that's comfortable or has a logo of their favorite sports team or is designer. You're going to see all of that, trust me. My mask is very utilitarian. It's just gray. It makes me look like Hannibal Lecter a little bit, but it works. And it covers up my face in a way that is very effective. What it also does, though, is it fogs up my glasses like you wouldn't believe. Now, there are ways to avoid that that I understand. If you just Google it on the internet, you can find all kinds of YouTube videos about it. The problem is if you have glasses like this that are anti-glare and have a treatment on them already, those hacks that you see on the internet aren't very effective to prevent the glare. So there are ways to have masks that have metal bindings here that stick closer to your nose to prevent air from coming out. And if you can get those kinds of masks, they're helpful. Otherwise, allowing air to come out below is going to be the better way to go because it won't back up into your glasses and make them fog up. What I have learned is my best solution to this, honestly, is to wear my contact lenses because then I'm not worried about it at all. But if you are going to make these masks available, and certainly disposable masks are the ones you need to have for customers, if you have permanent masks and you want to have cloth ones for your customers, obviously they need to be laundered after a single use. The dealership is in a position where it needs to pay for these masks, even the portable, or rather the temporary and disposable ones. That's true also for your employees. I would encourage you to have your employees wear cloth masks and to provide them their cloth masks, to have other masks available. They're just more comfortable to wear over an extended period of time. And again, the idea is you want to get people used to the idea of wearing these masks. We talked a little bit about taking temperatures before. I've discussed already the idea of the EOC's position as it relates to taking temperatures. Just like they permit the COVID active infection testing, they allow also taking temperatures. Once this pandemic is over, once they have a vaccine in place, they will rescind that rule, I am sure. And so for those employers who have inquired of us whether they should have infrared cameras, make a significant investment in those kinds of devices, which are even less intrusive in that they just measure the temperature of anyone walking in front of it. You know, so you place it at an entrance, for example. My advice to those clients who have reached out on that is to say, why don't you wait a little bit to see how long this is going to last before you make that kind of investment? Because the chances are you're going to spend $3,000 to $5,000 on this device and then have to turn it off once the EO says it's an impermissible medical inquiry. So if you've already invested in one, you're you know, at the cutting edge of technology, and that's to be commended. At the same time, be prepared for having something collect dust if the EOC issues that order once this is all done. When we talk about what to record with respect to the temperature taking, the goal is to record only pass-fail, either high or low, above the minimum or the maximum temperature number or below, and to not record the actual temperature. That's the better approach, we think, from an OSHA standpoint. Again, we talked about PPE and wage hour issues, so we don't need to cover that again. There are some alternatives to the taking of temperatures. One of the things that we have seen some clients utilize are, again, talking about technology, are some wristbands that are wearable that actually take temperature on an ongoing basis of the employee. The thing that's helpful about this is that if we get to a point where the EEOC says that's now an impermissible medical inquiry, you can just tell people to stop wearing them. There are some concerns that some employees may find this to be intrusive because it can provide on a kind of a Bluetooth way access that employers have to their temperature at any time that the employer chooses to look into what their current temperature is. What many of these apps actually do, though, is only provide information to the employer when the temperature exceeds a certain level. So in that sense, you can kind of assure the employees, look, we're not looking at whether you're 96.8 or 96.2. We're looking at whether you're above 100.4, so we won't even be given a notification by the app until you are at that place. And we view that as a safety measure for you, employee. We want to know when it looks as if your temperature is spiking, because we may know even before you do, before you even get the sense that you are coming down with an illness. Now, of course, it is entirely possible that somebody who has a temperature above 100.4 does not have coronavirus. But if they also combine that temperature with other symptoms like shortness of breath, like a cough, you can be in a place where you can send them home. Some employers are sending employees home even just with that temperature above that number. And so this kind of device is actually something helpful, I think, as we consider whether to have an alternative to test-taking operations. Okay. We've talked a little bit about antibody testings. My concern, again, is the EEOC's guidance currently. I know that there are some employers who, even with the EEOC taking that step, they would prefer to continue having the option to require people to have antibody testing. One thing you can do is encourage your employees to get their own antibody testing so that they can feel more reassured about their chances of coming down with coronavirus. The reality about antibody testing, however, is this. The reliability is uncertain. If you test positive for antibodies, meaning you had coronavirus at some point, there's a question about whether that means you can't get coronavirus again. There's a question also about whether or not the level of antibodies in your system has a bearing on whether you're now, quote, immune from coronavirus. If you have a large reading of antibodies in your system, which likely means that you had a serious bout of coronavirus, it likely means that you are immune for an extended period of time, maybe up to 3 years. If you have a lower number of antibodies, it could mean something different, maybe not even immunity at this point. So as you've heard I mean, I'm no Dr. Fauci, but as you've heard Dr. Fauci say, there's really some uncertainty about whether or not this antibody testing is going to be really helpful for employers. So if you want to encourage people to take it, that is a way around the EEOC's guidance, because if you're not mandating it, it's not your own medical inquiry to do so. Again, I'm always focused on wage hour issues, but if you're not doing antibody testing in the workplace, that is not going to be an issue for you. Okay, so as people are coming back to work, there are some things that we want to cover as it relates to your employees' worries about coming back to work, their concerns about whether they're in a particularly susceptible group. And so as you're thinking about this, as you're evaluating it, something that you need to keep in mind is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Family and Medical Leave Act, and the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. Even if you are concerned about your employees who are over 65, and we know that older individuals are more susceptible to this coronavirus issue, telling your older employees that they may not come back to work because they're a certain age is going to likely violate the ADEA, unless there is a government rule that is out there requiring you to do so. Now, we don't see any of those likely in any circumstance, but that is something that you should keep in mind. Again, the government is going to control. If we're complying with the government ordinance, that's one thing. If we just say we don't want to run the risk of anybody older getting this disease, we can't just make that apply to those individuals over 65, say. Now, if someone, though, says that they are susceptible because of a pre-existing medical condition that may, in fact, wind up being a disability in and of itself, we do need to consider whether there's an interactive process that needs to be engaged in as we consider whether we need to make some adjustments for that person. The adjustments, just like any interactive process you've heard me talk about over the years, is going to be individualized. There's no one size fits all. So it may be that if your rule is not to have, the facial coverings, it may be that having facial coverings around that person might be one of the ways to resolve it. It might be providing them a new office space that has a door that will not permit other people to enter into. That's not always going to be possible, though, for certain individuals, like salespeople. If there is an actual medical condition which is causing their worry, that's when the ADA kicks in. On the other hand, if they're just worried, if they're just thinking that there might be a concern that they might, catch coronavirus and they don't want to come back to work because of it, that's not going to be enough in and of itself just to refuse to come back to work. Now, you are certainly permitted as an employer to make a decision about whether you want to allow that person to take time off, to have leave, to exercise PTO. All of those things are certainly something you can consider. On the other hand, you don't have to, because there's no other legal obligation requiring you to do so. So what that really means is that if someone asks you whether they are required to come, is it mandatory I have to come back to work? The first thing you need to understand is, well, why are you concerned? If they point to an illness, I have diabetes, I have an autoimmune condition that my doctor tells me means I am susceptible and I should stay home. If any of that is what's going on, then begin to engage in the interactive process, get medical information from the doctor, understand more what the nature of the request is so you can tailor your response to that person's particular information. On the other hand, if it's just, I don't know, man, I'm a little worried, then I think the way to approach that is to say, okay, I understand your concern, and certainly we are sensitive to that, but we do have a job that you need to do. Let's talk about what we can do to try to alleviate your concern. And that may be enough to get the person back to work, to become productive, and to do so without disrupting the workplace. You're going to want to make sure that the ADA is being complied with, and is really going to be the principal concern that we have as we're evaluating these kinds of requests from employees. Again, if you've got a sense, if you already know that an employee has an underlying health condition because they've gone out on leave before, or they've told us that this is an issue that they have, and then they come forward and provide this request to be accommodated, then it's an easy call. You're going to be needing to engage in that interactive process. It's also something that you ought to consider raising on your own. If you know that somebody has an autoimmune issue, or has Graves' disease, or has lupus, or something that really requires significant care to avoid getting infected with coronavirus, then you're going to want to make sure that you raise the issue with them first, and that's okay. The EOC says that's not an impermissible medical inquiry. I know, for example, one of our lawyers in our firm, his spouse has lupus, and they have groceries delivered to their home. His wife never leaves the house. He literally spends 30 minutes a day washing the groceries that are being delivered at the sink, making sure that everything is completely pristine. So that kind of person is not really going to be someone who can be in a work environment. And so if that person can work from home, then certainly that's someone that we would want to make sure that we're doing what we can to accommodate from an ADA standpoint. As I said before, the question of whether you can fire someone if they decide they don't want to come in and there's no other reason for them not to come in, the legal answer is probably yes, but the practical answer, I think, is let's consider every other alternative before we go down that road. And certainly before we pull the trigger on that, we want to make sure that we consult counsel and make sure we know what really our risks are going forward with that kind of a separation. Leave is almost always the better approach. Even an unpaid medical leave under FMLA is a better approach than just cutting them loose entirely, especially if we can see the light at the end of the tunnel with this pandemic as we go along. We talked about ADA assessments, and so we probably don't need to go any further. I know you're receiving a question now very similar to the kinds of issues we've been covering. I think I can probably go forward to the next slide because we've really covered that one and what we've discussed. We've talked about temperature taking, and one of the things that I think we need to kind of consider is what happens when somebody turns up sick at work or just tells us they have developed, some sense of sickness at work, even if they've tested negative on a temperature during the course of their time at work. What do we do with this employee? Well, keep in mind, we want to exercise an abundance of caution as we evaluate what to do with these people. And that means we want to eliminate them immediately from the workplace from a physical standpoint. We want to get them home so that we can make sure that we can better assess what the circumstance is. And if they are in fact sick, we can assure that it's not coronavirus. Even if it appears that someone just has what we normally consider a cold, the best approach is to have someone sent home. Now, what you may find is that employees will resist this. They'll say, I don't feel sick, or look, I can power through. This is what I normally do. If someone makes that pushback on you, I think the answer needs to be, I get it, I understand it, and if you can work from home, if there's a way for you to do this in a telecommuting way, then that's great. Go work from home where we can be certain you can't infect anybody except your spouse and your kids and your dog. But if you are here, you may infect someone. And so we want to be careful about that, both for your safety and for the safety of those around you. You want to also make sure, particularly if you get a sense that there is a positive COVID test, you're going to want to do your own internal contact tracing. And by that, I mean you want to ask the employee who they were in contact with in the 48 hours before they began having symptoms. That may mean everybody. It may mean only a handful of people. But for those individuals, we're going to want to let them know that someone else that they have come into contact with in the workplace has tested positive for coronavirus. Now, if someone comes to you and says,
my daughter has tested positive for coronavirus and she lives with us. What do you do then? Well, in that instance, the best approach is to send that employee home as well. But I think the notification of other employees is premature at this point. Until that employee gets tested and tests positive, that's when you would take the next step and go the next route with the contact tracing internally and the notification of these other employees, because there's really no need to worry and to alarm individuals until you have a better sense that there is in fact a real risk that these other individuals may have been exposed. I mean, think about it. It really could be just, panic city if every time someone whose brother-in-law's nephew, got that you had contact with like once for 10 minutes, is that the kind of circumstance where we're going to want to go then tell that employee who has that indirect connection with all these other people to go to those other individuals and say, hey, Frank's brother-in-law's nephew tested positive for coronavirus? Because it'll start freaking people out. It really will. And then they're going to want to have a test done and so forth. So the further afield that is, the less worry you should have. And even if there's someone that they are living with, have that person stay home, have them get tested, and then that's when the notification process will begin. Obviously, if you know that they have coronavirus because they tested positive, you're going to want to sanitize their work area in that deep clean way that we talked about before. And keep in mind that Families First Act that was passed right at the beginning of the pandemic that provides 2 weeks of sick leave that is paid in the circumstance where somebody has coronavirus or has the symptoms that associate with coronavirus. If that person, if somebody tests positive, they may very well be entitled to those 2 weeks of paid sick leave under that part of Families First. One of the things that clients ask me many times is, well, do they also get paid FMLA leave if they've got coronavirus? The answer actually is no. They will be eligible for unpaid FMLA, but they will not be eligible for the paid portion of that extended family and medical leave portion. There's really a very limited use of that, and it's for when the individual is the primary caregiver of a minor, and that minor's school is closed because of the pandemic. And many people had that and have exhausted that already because they have been in that situation during the end of this academic period. It's the spring semester.
Hey, Steve, I have a question that came in.
Sure thing.
If there is a positive case in your dealership or in your office, is there any requirement to communicate that to the public, like what we're seeing at certain restaurants and other cases where it is being communicated? Or is that more like, okay, we're a restaurant, here we are, and lots of people come here. You want to make sure.
Right, it's a great question. We have been looking at that question now for the past several days because not only dealership clients, but other clients have been asking that question. And so far, what we've been able to determine is that there's no legal obligation to go forward with to do your own external contact tracing process. Instead, what we recommend for dealerships to do is to, as soon as this has taken place, as soon as you've got a confirmed positive test, let's say for a salesperson, what we would recommend that you do is reach out to your local health department, if it's either the Harris County Public Health Department or whoever it might be, to let them know, to report to them that there has been a positive case of coronavirus from an employee in your dealership who has had interactions with the public. We have begun the process of doing some internal contact tracing to determine which of our employees may have been exposed to that person, and we're taking steps to deal with that. But we wanted you to know about it because that person did have dealings with the public, and we can provide you the names of those individuals if you want to engage in that contact tracing. Now, If that public health department says, we're so busy we can't do it, would you do it? Then I would recommend that you do so in contacting the customers. If, on the other hand, they do not, they say, no, we'll handle that, that's our job, we're the experts, then I would say leave it to the experts. Let them be the ones reaching out to those customers so that they can say, you know, you have been exposed potentially to someone who had coronavirus. The reason I say that is because, again, they're the experts, but also it is entirely possible that the individual at the public health department will not necessarily identify which consumer retail operation reached out to them to let them know. And so it may be that they just say, we have received a report from a retail operation that you have visited in the past 48 hours that there may be a circumstance where you've been exposed to coronavirus. And so we recommend that you have coronavirus testing. Come to our facility, we'll get it done for you. That to me would be a better PR circumstance than having to try to contact the customer ourselves and let them know. Now, is it illegal or improper to reach out to them ourselves? No, you can do so if you think that that would be a better PR way to deal with it. But the reality is that we have not uncovered any legal obligation yet, Colin, that suggests that they need to go do that themselves.
And thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. I did get one more question, and I think
Sure.
you were going to talk briefly about PPP maybe at the very end. So if you want to push this off, let's push it off. I had a question come in that asked, can a positive COVID employee get paid through the PPP loan?
So the question is whether that person who is receiving, or their dealership is receiving PPP, whether funds can be used to pay for that employee's compensation?
Yes, I believe so. And I know that's got a lot of many different tentacles that go along with it.
It does.
Because if they're actually being paid by, and I'll answer part of this and you can fill in the blanks. If you are actually paying that employee, whether you're paying them vacation or sick or PTO or whatever it might be, or just paying them, whatever their normal salary or a percentage of normal salary, I hear 75% all the time, then yes, you are paying them and therefore they are eligible PPP expenses. But then the second piece is, well, what if they are on, one of the state programs where they're being paid through like unemployment or other pieces? Typically the answer to that is, I believe the answer is no, because you're not actually paying them. Somebody else is paying them.
Right. That's exactly right, Colin. And in addition, if, for example, that individual seeks the paid sick leave that we talked about before, those 2 weeks of paid sick leave under the Families First Act, that is a different methodology for reimbursing the employer, because that is a payroll tax credit that comes later and instead of part of the loan forgiveness. So it's my understanding that you are going to need to avoid double dipping in the sense of being reimbursed through your loan forgiveness and also being reimbursed through the payroll tax credit process. You can't do both. So at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. They're being paid. If they're being paid through PPP, I would just consider kind of keeping it in that circumstance during that period of time. And then just making sure you don't submit that as a payroll tax credit for fear that there might be a view that you're double dipping. So in the time we have left, I want to cover a few other things that we want to make sure we kind of zoom through. And you'll have these slides, as Colin says. If you have any follow-up questions, you can certainly reach out, and I'm happy to answer those questions. One of the questions we have been getting from clients is, what should we require our employees and or customers to do in the way of waivers? Are they effective? Is it something we should consider, and so on? The first thing I would recommend that you do is reach out to your insurance broker to see whether or not you actually might be covered under your general liability policy in case some customer got sick at work. One of the things that I think is going to be very difficult for anybody who attempts to assert some kind of legal claim for having come down with coronavirus is to prove causation. You know, was it really that they caught coronavirus when they went to the dealership to negotiate for a car, or when they went to Whataburger afterwards and got, you know, a hamburger in the drive-thru? I don't know how they're going to be able to determine that. And, you know, the way that things are going now with the economy opening up further and further, people are seeing more and more people. I just don't know how they're going to do it. So the risk of liability, in my view, is lower and lower. But it's a good idea to ask your broker, hey, if somebody does get coronavirus, is that covered under our policy? I've had a number of clients check, and they were surprised that there is no exclusion for virus. Some clients have said, you know, it's weird, there's an exclusion for bacteria, but not for virus. And so it's an interesting thing. I would check on that. If you have coverage, that's even probably less of a reason to have a waiver. And the reason I say that is because when you present a customer a waiver and say, hey, yeah, come on in and shop for a car, but sign this legal document because we don't want you to sue us if you get sick. That's a kind of a PR bad taste, if you know what I mean. And so it would be less of a concern, I think, if you knew you had coverage. In Texas, unlike many states, we actually have a body of law that is pretty aggressive in the enforceability of these liability waivers. The reality, though, is for them to be enforceable, they have to be specific. They have to clearly describe what the risk is, and they have to clearly describe what you're waiving. And so the thing that is making waivers somewhat limited as well is that, let's say a mom comes in to shop for, you know, a pickup truck. She actually catches coronavirus from one of your employees. She signed a waiver. That's great. But she then goes home and then gives it to her kid. The kid hasn't signed a waiver. The husband hasn't signed a waiver. And so the value of that waiver is going to be somewhat limited. So what are the alternatives to waivers that you might want to consider? Well, at least with respect to employees, I think a health attestation, a document indicating that, you know, I've checked these boxes and I do not currently have symptoms associated with coronavirus. That's something that you might want to consider giving to customers as well. You can put these forms at the receptionist desk and say, or whether you're taking temperature or not, you can have them say, hey, listen, you know, for your safety and the safety of the others around you, we're going to want to just make sure that you haven't had these symptoms in the past 24 hours or 48 hours. And so if you do so, what I've discovered is if you make it a check the box kind of thing, most people are going to say no problem at all, and they'll do it. That is something that I have found to be the case, that while at the beginning of this thing, most employees and customers, just basically everyone, kind of bristled at the idea of some of these changes that were around. You know, the idea of masks, what are you talking about? I mean, I'm not going to wear a muzzle. There's certainly a resistance to it still, but what I am seeing now is more and more people being, wearing these masks. As I mentioned the other day, I saw probably 95% of the people were wearing them in the tunnels. And I think that people are, A, getting used to it, and B, they're a little worried about the spike. And so keep in mind that you'd be surprised that people are going to be comfortable with these new changes, even though it's something that you might think they might otherwise be worried about. So I like the idea of having employees sign these acknowledgments. I don't think having employees sign waivers is going to be effective, in part because the claim that an employee would assert would be, if they felt they caught coronavirus at work, would be a workers' compensation claim. And you can't waive a workers' compensation claim anyway, so there's really no value having an employee sign off on that waiver. So we talked a little bit about this PPP issue. What I really want to cover here is just kind of a brief history of how we got to where we are. The short version is that this has been an adjusting process as we've gone along. So, the law actually was passed all the way back in March. I can't even remember March. It's just bizarre how it's felt like this has gone on for like months and months and months and sometimes years. But that came out in March. They moved pretty quickly on it. they did have a relatively significant amount of PPP money that kind of got wiped through pretty quick. The one thing that most individuals began to become apprehensive about were the representations that had to be made on the application about there not being any other available source of cash to fund the payroll and so forth. And that was something that many employers took a second thought about and considered, in some cases, even returning the funds. That extended deadline for the safe harbor went to May 18th. And then there was the loan forgiveness process that they released the rules on May 20th. And then on June 5th, just recently, in the past couple of weeks, the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act was implemented. And there were three things that I just want to cover quickly that this act covers. Number one, it adjusts the covered period. The problem was that, because of the fact that many industries were closed, they didn't have any people working, and so they were being paid something when they weren't doing any work. And so they've extended the covered period now so that it goes all the way through 12/31. It's the earlier of the 24 weeks, and from the disbursement period are all the way to the end of the year. You can still focus on the 8-week period if you took the loan out before June 5th. But if you haven't, and you're just now getting the money, you can actually be utilizing this covered period that is extended. In addition, the original PPP program had a limit of 75, or actually a minimum of 75% of the money had to be used for payroll costs, a maximum of 25% for the other covered costs that were out there. They've adjusted that down to 60% for payroll. So just keep in mind, when you are going to loan forgiveness, as long as you've got at least 60% of the funds that you received in the PPP program, you're still going to be eligible for the loan forgiveness process. And then lastly, on the loan terms, there was originally a 2-year payback period, but because they're expecting substantial delays in the review process, as well as in the loan forgiveness process, which they anticipate will happen, they've extended the payback period to 5 years, but the interest rate is still the same. So I want to cover in the time that we have left, some of you all may have recalled that the last couple of times we've talked about discrimination, I have mentioned that in the Fifth Circuit, and particularly in Texas, Title VII covers, and the Age Discrimination and Disabilities Act cover race and sex and national origin and color and religion, and then age and disability. But it doesn't cover sexual orientation, and it doesn't cover transgender status. That's just the law of the land in the Fifth Circuit. That's what I've been telling you folks for a long time. But it may have been the last time that I was with you all that I mentioned that this is now up for review, or was at the time up for review by the Supreme Court. If you've seen the news, you haven't been living under a rock for the past few days, you know that the Bostock case came down. It was a 6-3 decision, and the answer now is very clear. Sexual orientation and transgender status is covered by Title VII. This means that all employers in the United States are going to need to adjust their discrimination policies, their EEO policies, so that sexual orientation and transgender status are included in the list of protected categories. It's not mandatory. The EEOC is not saying you must include them specifically, because the Supreme Court's ruling was based upon the notion that sexual orientation and transgender discrimination is encompassed in the prohibition against sex discrimination. So if you just say sex, you can keep it at just sex, but the problem is that as you implement the policy and as you execute on complaints that are made by employees, if you do not recognize that sexual orientation and transgender status are now prohibited as a matter of federal law, you're going to run into significant problems with the EEOC as they investigate these claims. So again, it's critical as we go through the process of evaluating terminations. So many of you all call and ask, you know, Steve, I want to run a termination past you to see what you think, or what's our risk associated with it? And you often are hearing me say, well, let's talk a little bit about, is the employee over 40? You know, are they any other protected categories? Have you documented well? You all know I'm a big fan of documentation. All of those questions, one of the questions I'm going to ask now is, are you aware of the sexual orientation of the employee, or whether the employee is, you know, a transgender person? And, you know, the chances are you're going to answer no to both those questions, but you're going to need to be mindful of them, because certainly if you are motivated by the decision, but by the fact that they're in those categories, I'm going to tell you, we can't do that anymore. You might have been able to do that a month ago, but you can't do it now. So that is a significant development, and I really felt, even though it wasn't connected to COVID in any way, it's really something that you need to know about. So please, you know, take that home with you. Talk to your GMs, your HR people, to understand that this is something that really is a dramatic change. I was telling Colin before the call, this is the biggest change to Title VII since the 1980s, when sexual harassment was, you know, decided by the Supreme Court to be an actionable item under gender discrimination in Title VII. And in a sense, it was a very similar process. Back in the 1980s, the notion was that, well, sex discrimination was included in Title VII, but it doesn't use the word sex harassment. So if there's no discrimination in that I'm like firing you or I am demoting you, then how can I be violating Title VII? Well, the Supreme Court said, well, even if you're not taking an adverse employment action against them, but you're just making their life miserable, that's still prohibited by Title VII. And so in that same way that the door is open for this whole new body of law, sex harassment, now we're seeing that the doors are being opened to sexual orientation, discrimination, and transgender status. The biggest challenge, I think, for employers is going to be not changing the way you do decisions about hire, fire, et cetera. It's going to be making sure that there's no harassment on the basis of these categories. Because I can assure you, there are people in your dealership who have been used to and very comfortable with the idea of making jokes and making fun of people who are transgender, making fun and making jokes of people who are lesbian or gay or bisexual. That's going to be considered illegal harassment now, and that's going to take a while for us to get our employees used to. That means increased training. That means reminders of the policy, and that's why I do think it's going to be necessary to issue new policies that include these categories in them. So just, again, that's the bonus topic for the day. A freebie added on top of the program on COVID, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of that so that you can take that back to your dealerships.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate you adding that on to the end, and as always, really appreciate you coming and presenting. Now we do have some time for some Q&A. I know y'all have actually been very quiet. It's kind of abnormal for this group. So I do have one question out there that I thought I'd go ahead and ask. I'd love for you all to start, either raise your hands, if I guess you don't want to talk, you can type a question up in the Q&A. The question we have, Steve, is an employee covered if schools don't open up in the fall and the person has to take leave to homeschool a grandchild? I guess you would say grandchild or child, and maybe there's different answers to one or the other.
Right. Grandchild, I don't believe would necessarily be covered under the paid family and medical leave provision we just talked about. What you may find, though, is that many of those individuals would have already exhausted their family and medical leave paid portion in the spring semester, because it's going to only still a maximum of 12 weeks in any given 12-month period. So they may not have eligible paid leave, but if for whatever reason they didn't take that paid leave in the spring, if they came to you and said, Hog Elementary is not open and I got to stay home and homeschool my kid, so I'd like to have my paid FMLA leave. I didn't take it before, I took some, but I still have 6 weeks left. I'd like to exercise that right. You must allow them to do it, and you must pay them for it, subject to that payroll tax credit we talked about. Now, if they've exhausted it and they just ask for the opportunity to be at home, we're back to that circumstance where they don't have a legal right to be home, but the practical issue is going to be, do we really want to, terminate someone in that circumstance? You may have no choice. You may decide that in that situation, there's really no other option other than getting somebody else in there. You can put them on an unpaid leave and extend that period of time as long as you care to, if you'd like to go that route as well. But that paid sick leave is still going to be applicable in the fall as long as they haven't exhausted it, and as long as it's their own child under 18 and not a grandchild.
So I guess maybe there would be a caveat if it was a grandchild, but you're the primary caregiver in it all. I would say that it would fall more into the parent situation, correct?
That's right. And even for the parent, it may not be that there's going to be a requirement to allow them to do it. I would exhaust all options, though. If I found, especially if it was somebody I didn't want to lose, I would try to figure out a way that, what can we do to have you work from home while you're teaching your kid, et cetera. Similar to what a lot of people were doing in the spring semester with their kids.
Okay. Since we don't have any other questions, I thought I would open it up. Steve, is there one question that you've gotten asked a lot that you think would be good to share and to go over scenarios on what that answer is? And then we'll go ahead and call it a webinar.
There you go. Well, maybe I'll take this opportunity to plug the slide I'm actually showing now. What many of you all have indicated that you've used the resources at our website and have really appreciated them. And I would love to be able to take credit for doing those things. I got to tell you, I haven't done squat. It's been other people working their butts off in our firm to come up with, in many cases, completely free resources for our clients and for other companies that are interested. And it's been a huge success, and I really commend those people who have been working on it. What you will find if you go to those locations, that there are a number of situations that may actually prompt questions that you didn't have. But to answer your question directly, Colin, on the question of, what are the issues, what are the questions that we're seeing? Honestly, most of them have dealt with the issue of what happens when somebody turns up sick. But we don't think that they have coronavirus. Normally people have been, again, just working through and plowing through, and we kind of commend them as being hard workers and dedicated and loyal people. The mindset needs to change now. Those people are not helping you, they're hurting you, because they're putting not only the safety and health of others in your workforce at risk, they could decimate your workforce. I mean, they could literally put your company in a position where you're now not in a position to do the work you need to do, because it just runs like wildfire through your dealership. So I would say that the mindset needs to change, both of the individual who is now coming down with the illness, but also the mindset needs to be changed of the manager who deals with that person. So if we can kind of do a flip on that, flipping that switch, I think that we're going to be in a much better circumstance. So when I deal with questions that come from employers, it's usually about the issue of, what do I do with the person who does not want to come back to work because they're just a little worried, because they're just afraid? And what I normally will recommend in that instance is the first thing is to just do a little bit of hand-holding with that person and to make them understand that we're taking these following steps to make sure that our employees are safe at work. And then you basically read the list. You know, you go through and you talk about the cleaning. You talk about the rules regarding social distancing. You talk about the rules regarding employees being sent home the moment that they appear that they're going to be sick. Mask and face coverings rules, and on and on and on. And if there is an opportunity to allow somebody to work from home, even giving them potentially that option. But by giving them that reassurance, you can maybe put them in a position where they feel more confident that going to work will be as healthy and safe as going to HEB, going to the gas station, going to the places where they already are going. And if you can get them feeling confident in that way, I think they're going to be much better, suited and ready to come back to work.
Perfect. That's great. And yes, I did want to reemphasize, as I did at the beginning, Steve's been a great resource to our clients and our other contacts. And I would definitely encourage you to reach out to Steve when you have questions. You get some great guidance and great answers. And I've really appreciated working with you over the years, Steve, and especially now with all these crazy new things going on all the time. It's even more fun seeing all the different questions that are coming out. So again, thank you for participating, and we'll see you all at our next roundtable webinar.
There you go.
Thanks
Thanks,
again,
guys.
Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining us. To stay up to date on all of the webinars for this series, please make sure to follow our CRT page for more information. Link is in the description below, along with other important links, including our social media. If you want to see future Lane Gorman Trubitt Dealership Controllers Roundtable webinar series videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications.